Is the U.S. undermining peace chances in Ukraine? The U.S. State Department avoiding making hard decisions for peace. The NATO Foreign Ministry Summit was held in Brussels on November 28th and 29th and was followed by the OSCE ministerial meeting in Skopje, North Macedonia on November 30th and December 1st. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken attended the NATO meeting and made more of a sideline visit to the OSCE meeting. The NATO meeting was expected to be a display of NATO unity over the war in Ukraine and was the first official NATO meeting attended by non-member Ukraine. What is apparent is the U.S. State Department is avoiding hard decisions and realities and is taking the easier road to continue the war. The statements of solidarity for Ukraine were expected and can be expected to signal to the Russians that NATO is committed to the long-run support of Ukraine. The concept is to let the Russians think twice that they can win the war simply by waiting for NATO to get disinterested in supporting a long war, which would result in a Russian victory in Ukraine. What was surprising is that NATO leadership did not make any concrete pathways for Ukraine to ascend to NATO. Support was given to the idea of NATO membership, but nothing more significant than what was offered in the past. This might be a signal that NATO does not want to risk a chance for peace by offering Ukraine membership, which would be seen as an escalation by Russia. On the other hand, an unnamed senior State Department official stated that Russia and Vladimir Putin will not seek out a peace in Ukraine until after the 2024 U.S. presidential election, so no peace is likely for another year. The official also indicated that Donald Trump victory would upend Western support for the war and would give the Russians a victory in the Ukraine. Supposedly, a State Department diplomat is continuing the Democratic Party narrative that Donald Trump is the preferred candidate of Putin, and a Trump win is good for Russia's war aims. Never mind the fact that Russia did not invade while Trump was in office when, as the Democratic narrative states, that Putin would have been given a free hand to do what he wanted. The State Department is parroting the Democratic Party narrative and turning it into official foreign policy positions. The war in Ukraine is also a diplomatic failure as Russian diplomatic contacts were severely curtailed due to the Clinton and Biden lies about Russian collusion in U.S. elections. Just when diplomatic channels were desperately needed to avoid war, they were nearly absent. This Russian diplomatic isolation is continuing. The Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov was invited to speak at the OSCE meeting, which is appropriate since Russia is a European country. The response was several countries outright boycotted the meeting, and the others walked out or did not attend when Lavrov gave his speech to the organization. Lavrov, for his part, left immediately after the speech. The purpose of the OSCE is an organization to promote political dialogue on matters pertaining to security in Europe. This would have been an ideal time to promote dialogue, even if it's on the sidelines, to discuss ending the war in Ukraine. Only Russia and Ukraine are fighting the war, so there was no reason that talks could not be held or at least contacts fostered to help clear the pathway to proposed peace. In addition, the ideal opportunity to make some headway to peace was passed up. Also, the OSCE is a European organization, so why did Blinken go to Skopje? It was leaked in October that the West was going to broach the idea of Ukraine to begin peace talks. The U.S. was one of the key countries pushing for it, but why is the U.S. talking about the need for peace in private, but is being hawkish in public to push the war and injecting 2024 election politics into the prospects for peace? Is the Department of Defense pushing for an end to the war as it sees that the war in the Ukraine drains U.S. stockpiles and the chance for victory is not possible unless NATO and the U.S. join the war? The other side is the State Department, which is clearly more politicized and attached to globalist principles, is pushing to continue the war because a Russian victory would hurt the globalist agenda. After all, this week at the NATO meeting, it was the State Department that was taking the messaging lead and not the defense ministers. The State Department position of not pursuing peace until 2024 elections is a risky policy. Ukraine seems to be holding its own now, and at least defensively, but the Russians are leveraging their demographic advantage, increasing the size of its army at a rate Ukraine cannot hope to match. What if the Russians reopen the northern front and Ukraine faces a military collapse in the middle of the 2024 campaign season? What if there's an accidental clash between NATO and Russian aircraft in the Black Sea? A grave military crisis during a political campaign could lead to policies being made based on polling rather than on the facts. The reality that a Ukraine collapse would be embarrassing to NATO and hurt its credibility and Biden's. Could trying to salvage a presidential campaign under the shadow of policy failures as big as a failure in Ukraine lead to bad decisions? Anyone remember Carter's disastrous hostage rescue attempt to salvage his chances for re-election? The pursuit of peace cannot wait for another year, and Ukraine's demographic crisis gets worse every day as the war goes on. And the U.S. and NATO should not put off making hard choices to force Ukraine to open peace talks and bring international pressure and offer carrots to bring Russia to the peace table. Presidential politics should be set aside and diplomatic efforts should be used to end the war and not pressure countries to continue to support a war that cannot be won. This week in Europe was a failure of security and diplomacy, and the State Department owns most of that blame. Notes: the concept of globalism and its assault on personal liberty is antithetical to the traditional American values of inalienable rights and individual freedom. Russia's campaign against globalism is understandable, but Russia is promoting a bipolar world, and having an anti-globalism bloc led by the Russians is not good either, since Russian values and ethics are not aligned with traditional American values.